The emergency radio crackled to life in the dispatch center, cutting through the routine chatter with a voice that shouldn't exist. "Command, this is Phoenix 7, requesting immediate medical evacuation for multiple casualties." The operator's hand froze over her keyboard. Phoenix 7 had been officially dead for 8 years. The small town of Cedar Falls, Montana, had always prided itself on its quiet predictability. Nothing much happened here except the changing of seasons and the occasional tourist passing. Through on their way to Glacier National Park, the local emergency services rarely dealt with anything more serious than a fender bender or a hiker with a twisted ankle. Which is exactly why the newest volunteer at the Cedar Falls Fire Department seemed almost too ordinary to notice. Elena Martinez had appeared in town 6 months ago, renting a small apartment above the local bakery and quickly establishing herself as just another face in the community. She was polite but reserved, the kind of person who nodded hello at the grocery store but didn't linger for small talk. When she'd walked into Fire Chief Tommy Walsh's office to volunteer, she'd presented herself as someone looking for a way to give back to her new community. Nothing more, nothing less. "I've got basic first aid training," she told Walsh, her voice carrying a slight rasp that suggested she'd been a smoker, though no one had ever seen her with a cigarette. "Used to work in logistics. Figured I could help with equipment maintenance or administrative stuff." Walsh had been grateful for any help. The Cedar Falls Volunteer Fire Department was perpetually understaffed, operating with a core group of 12 volunteers who juggled their regular jobs with emergency response duties. Elena's offer to help with the mundane tasks of inventory, management, and equipment checking was exactly what they needed. What struck everyone as slightly odd was how Elena seemed to know her way around the firehouse almost immediately. She located tools without asking, understood the layout of equipment storage better than volunteers who'd been there for years, and had an uncanny ability to spot potential problems with gear before they became serious issues. But in a small town where everyone appreciated efficiency, these quirks were welcomed rather than questioned. "She's got a good eye for detail," commented Jake Morrison, a volunteer who'd been with the department for 15 years. "Caught that frayed rope on the rescue equipment last week before anyone else noticed it. Could have been a real problem if someone had tried to use it in an emergency." Elena always deflected such praise with a modest shrug. "Just paying attention," she'd say, then quickly change the subject to something mundane like supply orders or maintenance schedules. She had a way of making herself useful while remaining practically invisible, handling the background work that kept the department running smoothly without ever pushing herself forward for recognition. Her apartment reflected the same careful anonymity. The few neighbors who'd glimpsed inside described it as spartanly furnished but meticulously clean. A single bookshelf held a mix of mystery novels and technical manuals about emergency response procedures. The only personal touches were a few landscape photographs of mountains and forests that could have been taken anywhere in the northwestern United States. At Lou's Diner, where Elena grabbed coffee most mornings before heading to her part-time job at the local hardware store, the waitresses had given up trying to draw her into gossip or lengthy conversations. She was friendly enough, always said please and thank you, tipped well, but maintained a professional distance that discouraged personal questions. "She's running from something," speculated Betty, the diner's owner and unofficial keeper of town secrets. "Divorced, probably, or maybe lost her job somewhere and had to start over. You can always tell when someone's trying to reinvent themselves." The hardware store owner, Frank Kowalski, found Elena to be an ideal employee. She showed up on time, knew more about tools and equipment than he'd expected, and had a quiet competence that customers appreciated. She never called in sick, never complained about working weekends, and seemed genuinely interested in helping people find the right solutions for their projects. Customer came in last month looking for parts to fix his generator, Frank told his wife over dinner one evening. Elena not only knew exactly what he needed, but she drew him a diagram showing how to install it safely. Savage she'd worked with similar systems before. Don't know where she learned all that, but she's definitely been around machinery. What Frank didn't know was that Elena spent her evenings studying technical manuals and emergency response protocols with the intensity of someone preparing for an exam. Her kitchen table was often covered with diagrams of hydraulic systems, radio communication procedures, and medical triage guidelines. She approached this self-education with a methodical precision that suggested it was more than casual interest. At the one place Elena seemed most comfortable was during the fire department's weekly training sessions. While newer volunteers struggled with equipment operation or emergency procedures, Elena absorbed everything with an ease that bordered on instinctive. She never showed off or corrected others, but her competence was quietly apparent to anyone paying attention. "She's got natural instincts," observed Lisa Chen, the department's EMT coordinator. "Some people panic under pressure, even in training scenarios. Elena just gets calmer and more focused. It's like she's done this kind of work before, even though she says she hasn't." During a practice drill involving a simulated car accident, Elena had positioned herself to assist with victim extraction in a way that maximized efficiency while maintaining safety protocols. When asked how she'd known to anticipate the need for additional stabilization equipment, she'd simply said she'd been thinking ahead about potential complications. The truth was that Elena Martinez was thinking ahead about everything, all the time. She'd chosen Cedar Falls specifically because it was the kind of place where someone could blend in without attracting unwanted attention. Remote enough to discourage casual visitors, but with enough year-round residents to make a newcomer unremarkable. The volunteer fire department position gave her access to emergency radio frequencies and kept her skills sharp, while providing perfect cover for someone who needed to maintain a low profile. Her real name wasn't Elena Martinez, and she hadn't worked in logistics for a civilian company. But creating a new identity had been necessary 8 years ago, when circumstances beyond her control had required her to disappear completely. The official records showed that the person she used to be had died in a training accident that had been classified for national security reasons. The memorial service had been attended by military personnel who genuinely believed they were honoring a fallen hero. The irony wasn't lost on her that she'd found herself drawn back to emergency response work, even in this limited civilian capacity. After years of high-stakes missions where split-second decisions could mean the difference between success and catastrophe, the routine maintenance tasks and small-town training drills felt almost meditative. But they also kept her connected to the work that had defined most of her adult life, even if no one around her understood the true depth of her experience. Elena had become expert at deflecting personal questions with just enough information to satisfy curiosity without revealing anything substantial. She'd crafted a carefully neutral backstory that included growing up in various states due to a father's work in construction, which explained her lack of local connections and her familiarity with different types of equipment and environments. Military. Family? Jake had asked once, noting how Elena always seemed to anticipate the need for organization and backup plans. "Something like that," Elena had replied, which was technically true while revealing nothing meaningful. The closest she'd come to exposure was during a medical emergency at the hardware store when a customer had suffered what appeared to be a heart attack. Elena had immediately taken charge of the situation with a level of medical knowledge and command presence that had surprised everyone present. She'd performed CPR with textbook precision, coordinated with emergency responders over the radio using proper medical terminology, and maintained the victim's airway until the ambulance arrived. "Where did you learn to do that?" Frank had asked afterward, clearly impressed by her competence under pressure. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Red Cross certification, Elena had answered, producing a legitimate certificate she'd obtained under her current identity. It was true, though it represented only a fraction of her actual medical training. The incident had generated some talk around town about their mysterious hardware store clerk who apparently had hidden depths. But Elena had quickly deflected attention by emphasizing the importance of everyone getting proper first aid training. She'd even volunteered to help organize a community CPR class, effectively turning the focus away from her individual actions and toward a broader, public safety initiative. What the people of Cedar Falls didn't know was that Elena Martinez maintained a secure communication system in her apartment that allowed her to monitor emergency frequencies across a much wider area than their local jurisdiction. She'd positioned herself in Cedar Falls, partly because its location provided good radio reception for monitoring activities across several states. Old habits died hard, and staying aware of developing situations felt like a reasonable precaution for someone who'd made powerful enemies in her previous life. The equipment was carefully disguised and would appear to any casual observer as nothing more than a sophisticated ham radio setup, the kind that emergency enthusiasts often maintain for storm spotting or search and rescue coordination. Elena had even obtained an amateur radio license under her current identity to provide legitimate cover for the equipment's presence. Most nights, she'd scan frequencies while reviewing training materials or maintaining her physical fitness. The Keel routine helped her feel connected to the broader world of emergency response while maintaining the careful isolation that had kept her safe for 8 years. She told herself that this monitoring was purely precautionary, a way to stay informed about potential threats or situations that might require her to relocate again. But as autumn settled over Cedar Falls and the tourist season wound down, Elena found herself feeling more settled than she had in years. The work at the fire department was satisfying in a way she hadn't expected, and the community had accepted her presence without the probing questions she'd feared. For the first time since her official death, she was beginning to think that maybe she could build something resembling a normal life in this quiet mountain town. That sense of security was about to be shattered by an emergency that would force her to choose between maintaining her carefully constructed anonymity and using skills that only one person was supposed to possess. The radio call that would change everything was still hours away, but Elena Martinez's peaceful existence in Cedar Falls was already living on borrowed time. The first sign that Elena Martinez wasn't quite who she appeared to be came during a routine equipment inspection on a gray October morning. Fire Chief Walsh had assigned her to check the department's rescue rope inventory, a mundane task that typically involved little more than looking for obvious wear and updating the logbook. Elena approached the storage area with her characteristic quiet efficiency. But what happened next made several volunteers pause in their work. She didn't just examine the ropes visually like most people would. Instead, Elena ran her fingers along each strand with a practice technique that suggested extensive experience with climbing and rappelling equipment. Her inspection was methodical and thorough, checking stress points, examining the rope's core through the sheath, and testing the flexibility in ways that indicated deep familiarity with how rope failure actually occurred under extreme conditions. "This one's compromised," she announced, holding up a length of rope that looked perfectly fine to everyone else. "See this slight discoloration here? And the way the fibers feel when you twist them? This rope has been exposed to chemicals at some point, probably vehicle fluids. It'll hold normal weight, but under high stress, it could fail without warning." Jake Morrison leaned in to examine the rope, squinting at the area Elena had indicated. To him, it looked identical to all the others. "You sure about that? Looks okay to me." Elena's response was matter-of-fact. "Better safe than sorry." In rescue situations, you don't get second chances with equipment failure. The rope was sent out for professional testing, and the results came back 3 days later confirming Elena's assessment. The rope had indeed been contaminated with hydraulic fluid and would have failed at approximately 60% of its rated capacity. The discovery prompted a complete review of the department's rope inventory and led to the retirement of 2 additional lengths that showed similar contamination. "How did you know to look for that?" Lisa Chun asked Elena during next training session. "I've been doing this for 7 years, and I would never have caught that." Elena seemed to consider her answer carefully. "I guess I'm just naturally cautious about safety equipment. You hear stories about accidents caused by gear failure, and it makes you want to be extra careful." It was a reasonable explanation, but Lisa couldn't shake the feeling that Elena's knowledge went beyond general caution. The way she'd handled the rope, the specific terminology she'd used, and the confidence in her assessment all suggested hands-on experience with high-stakes rope work that went far beyond weekend hiking or casual climbing. The incident might have been forgotten if not for what happened 2 weeks later during the vehicle extrication training exercise. The department had arranged to practice with a donated car that was scheduled for scrapping, setting up a scenario where they'd need to remove an injured driver using their hydraulic rescue tools. Elena had volunteered to play the role of the victim, lying in the driver's seat while the team worked around her. Everything was proceeding normally until the hydraulic cutter jammed while cutting through the car's B-pillar. The tool was making concerning noises, and the newer volunteers were unsure how to proceed. Elena, still positioned as the mock victim, listened to the sounds for a moment before speaking up. "The pressure's building up behind a bent blade," she sighed, her voice calm but authoritative. "You need to release the pressure completely, back the blade out, and approach from a different angle. If you keep forcing it, you're going to damage the cutting head and probably bend the pillar, which will make extraction harder." The team stopped working and looked at her in surprise. Elena was supposed to be playing an unconscious victim, not providing technical guidance on hydraulic tool operation. Fire Chief Walsh, who was supervising the exercise, raised an eyebrow. "Elena, you're supposed to be injured and unresponsive." Elena's cheeks reddened slightly. "Sorry, Chief. The sound the tool was making seemed wrong. You know what a hydraulic cutter is supposed to sound like?" The question hung in the air for a moment before Elena answered. "I've watched a lot of training videos online. Emergency response techniques, equipment operation. I figured it would help me be more useful here." Walsh nodded slowly, but he made a mental note to ask Elena more about her background when they had a private moment. Her suggestion about the hydraulic tool proved to be exactly right, and the exercise continued smoothly once they followed her advice. But the incident raised questions about how someone with a background in logistics had developed such specific knowledge about rescue equipment operation. The questions multiplied during the following weeks as Elena continued to demonstrate unexpected competencies. During a first aid refresher course, she corrected the instructor on a detail about treating sucking chest wounds, explaining the proper technique with a precision that suggested medical training beyond basic CPR certification. When asked how she knew the procedure, Elena mentioned having taken an advanced wilderness first aid course years earlier. "Must have been quite a course," muttered Tom Rodriguez, one of the veteran volunteers. "She knows more about trauma medicine than some EMTs I've worked with." Elena's knowledge wasn't limited to medical procedures. During equipment maintenance, she demonstrated familiarity with radio systems that extended far beyond the department's simple communication setup. She could troubleshoot frequency interference, optimize antenna positioning, and explain technical aspects of radio propagation that surprised even the department's communications coordinator. "You ever work in radio?" asked Mike Sterling, who managed the department's communication systems as a volunteer. "Picked things up here and there," Elena replied, adjusting a radio setting that immediately improved reception clarity. "Technology's always interested me." But it wasn't just technical knowledge that set Elena apart. Her physical conditioning was remarkable for someone who claimed to work in logistics and hardware sales. During training exercises that involved carrying heavy equipment or moving through challenging terrain, Elena showed endurance and strength that impressed even the younger volunteers. She moved with an economy of motion that suggested extensive physical training, and she never seemed winded even during the most demanding drills. "Lady stays in shape," Jake observed to his wife after a particularly strenuous training session. "She was carrying that medical kit and backboard up that hill like it weighed nothing. Rest of us were huffing and puffing, but she wasn't even breathing hard." When questioned about her fitness routine, Elena mentioned running and hiking, which was plausible enough given the mountain environment around Cedar Falls, but her conditioning seemed to go beyond recreational exercise. She had the kind of functional strength and endurance that came from sustained, professional-level physical training. The accumulating evidence of Elena's unusual competencies began to generate quiet speculation among the volunteers during coffee breaks and after training sessions. Conversations increasingly turned to trying to figure out their mysterious colleague's background. "Military," was Jake's theory. "Has to be. The way she handles equipment, her physical condition, the medical knowledge. She's got to have military experience." "But she said she worked in logistics," Lisa pointed out. "Could be military logistics. Or she's not telling us everything," Tom suggested. "Maybe she had a different job before logistics. People change careers all the time." The speculation was conducted with genuine curiosity rather than suspicion. Elena was well-liked and respected for her contributions to the department, but her combination of skills and knowledge created a puzzle that the volunteers found increasingly difficult to ignore. Frank Kowalski had his own observations from Elena's work at the hardware store. Customers increasingly sought her advice on complex projects, and her recommendations consistently proved accurate. She could diagnose equipment problems with minimal information, suggest solutions that saved time and money, and explain technical concepts in ways that made sense to non-experts. "Had a contractor come in yesterday looking for parts to fix his air compressor," Frank told his regular customers one morning. Elena listened to his description of the problem for about 30 seconds, then walked him over to exactly the right valve assembly. Contractor said he'd been struggling with that compressor for weeks, and Elena figured out the issue just from hearing about the symptoms. What Frank didn't mention was that Elena had sketched a quick diagram showing the contractor how to test other components in the system to prevent similar failures in the future. The level of mechanical understanding she demonstrated suggested experience with complex equipment, maintenance that went well beyond typical consumer knowledge. The hardware store incident was part of a pattern that was becoming harder to overlook. Elena consistently demonstrated expertise that seemed inconsistent with her stated background, but she deflected attention with modest explanations that were technically plausible while revealing nothing substantial about her actual experience. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, who ran the local medical clinic, had her own encounter with Elena's unexpected knowledge during a community health fair where Elena had volunteered to help with blood pressure screenings. When an elderly participant had shown signs of a potential cardiac event, Elena had immediately recognized the symptoms and taken appropriate action while Dr. Mitchell was busy with another patient. "She handled the situation perfectly," Dr. Mitchell later told her nurse. "Recognized the early warning signs, got the patient seated and calm, administered oxygen, and had his medical history organized by the time I got there. Most people would have panicked or tried to do too much. Elena did exactly what a trained medical professional would do." When Dr. Mitchell had thanked Elena for her assistance, Elena had simply said she was glad she could help. But the doctor couldn't help wondering where a logistics worker had learned to recognize subtle cardiac symptoms and respond with such clinical competence. The cumulative effect of these incidents was creating a growing sense among Cedar Falls residents that Elena Martinez was considerably more capable than her quiet demeanor suggested. But Elena seemed to sense the increasing attention and became even more careful about demonstrating her knowledge. She started deflecting questions more frequently and avoided situations where her expertise might become obvious. The balance Elena had maintained for months was beginning to shift. Her careful anonymity was being eroded by the very competence that made her valuable to the community. Each demonstration of unexpected knowledge added another piece to a puzzle that observant people were starting to assemble. But Elena had dealt with operational security challenges before, and she adjusted her behavior accordingly. She became more selective about when to speak up, more careful about how she explained her knowledge, and more deliberate about maintaining her cover story. The people of Cedar Falls might be curious about their mysteriously capable volunteer, but Elena was determined to give them nothing concrete to build their suspicions upon. What Elena didn't anticipate was how her growing attachment to the community would complicate her ability to remain invisible. For the first time in 8 years, she was forming genuine connections with people who valued her contributions. The thought of having to disappear again was becoming increasingly difficult to contemplate. The radio call that would change everything was still days away, but the foundation for Elena's exposure was already being laid through 100 small observations and accumulating questions. In a small town where everyone knew everyone else's business, staying invisible required perfection. And perfection, Elena was beginning to realize, was becoming harder to maintain with each passing day. The breaking point came during a November storm that tested Cedar Falls' emergency response capabilities beyond anything the small town had experienced in recent memory. What started as a routine weather advisory escalated into a major crisis when a mudslide triggered by 3 days of heavy rain cut off the main highway and trapped a family of hikers in the mountains above town. Elena was monitoring weather reports from her apartment when the first emergency calls began coming through on her scanner. The initial reports were confusing and contradictory, but she quickly pieced together that the situation was more serious than anyone realized. The mudslide hadn't just blocked the road. It had also taken out several communication towers, severely limiting radio coverage in the affected area. At the fire station, chaos was rapidly replacing the usual orderly response procedures. Fire Chief Walsh was fielding calls from multiple agencies while trying to coordinate with county emergency management, but the communication blackouts were making it nearly impossible to get accurate information about the scope of the problem. "We've got unconfirmed reports of hikers who trapped above Cascade Falls," Walsh announced to the assembled volunteers. "County search and rescue is responding, but they're dealing with multiple incidents across the region. We're on our own for the initial response." Elena listened from the back of the room as the volunteers discussed their limited options. The standard hiking trails to Cascade Falls were impassable due to the mudslide, and the alternative routes were treacherous under the best conditions, let alone during a major storm. The department's radio equipment couldn't maintain reliable contact with the trapped hikers, making it impossible to assess their condition or coordinate a rescue. Jake Morrison voiced what everyone was thinking. "We're not equipped for this kind of operation. Maybe we should wait for county search and rescue to get organized." "Those hikers could be injured," Lisa Chun replied. "If they're stuck up there without shelter in this weather, waiting could mean the difference between a rescue and a recovery." The debate continued for several minutes, with volunteers arguing about capabilities, resources, and risks. Elena found herself analyzing the situation with increasing urgency, mentally cataloging the equipment they would need and the tactical challenges they would face. Despite her efforts to remain uninvolved, her mind was automatically developing contingency plans and alternative approaches. When Walsh asked for volunteers willing to attempt a preliminary reconnaissance mission, Elena surprised herself by stepping forward along with Jake and Ton Rodriguez. The plan was simple: hike to a position where they could establish radio contact, with the trapped family, assess their condition, and relay information back to Incident Command. The three-person team set out into the storm, carrying basic medical supplies, emergency communication equipment, and survival gear. The terrain was treacherous, with loose rock made slippery by constant rain and visibility reduced to mere yards by low-hanging clouds. Progress was slow and dangerous, requiring careful navigation and constant attention to changing conditions. After 2 hours of difficult hiking, they reached a ridge that should have provided radio contact with the trapped hikers. Jake attempted to establish communication while Tom and Elena set up a sheltered position for their equipment. But the radio calls went unanswered, and the team began to worry that they were too late. "Try adjusting the frequency," Elena suggested, listening to the static-filled attempts at communication. The storm might be affecting propagation. "Also, try using a longer antenna configuration." Jake looked at her questioningly. "How do you know about radio propagation?" Elena realized she'd revealed more technical knowledge than her cover story could easily explain, but the urgency of the situation overrode her caution. "I've done some reading about emergency communications. Weather can affect radio signals in predictable ways." She helped Jake modify their radio setup, demonstrating a familiarity with communication equipment that clearly surprised both men. Within minutes, they established weak but audible contact with the trapped hikers. The news was troubling. The family included an injured child who needed immediate medical attention, and their position was becoming increasingly dangerous as the storm continued to destabilize the surrounding terrain. "We need to get to them," Elena said after hearing the hiker's situation report. "The kid's description of his symptoms suggests a possible head injury. He needs medical evaluation soon." Tom shook his head. "The route to their position crosses that exposed ridge. One wrong step in this weather, and we're all casualties." Elena studied the terrain through her binoculars, mentally calculating routes and risk factors. Her assessment was based on navigation and tactical movement experience that went far beyond weekend hiking, but she forced herself to frame her observations in civilian terms. "There's an alternative approach through the timber," she said, pointing to a less obvious route. "It's longer, but it provides better cover and more stable footing. We could probably reach them in about an hour." Jake and Tom exchanged glances. Elena's suggested route wasn't on any of the standard hiking maps, and neither of them had considered it as a viable option. But her confidence in the assessment was compelling, and the trapped family situation was becoming more desperate with each passing hour. "How do you know about that route?" Tom asked. Elena hesitated before answering. "I've done some off-trail hiking since moving here, exploring the area, you know. I noticed that approach a few weeks ago." It was technically true, though it didn't explain how she'd identified the route so quickly or why she was confident about its viability under current conditions. Elena had indeed explored the area extensively, but her reconnaissance had been conducted with the systematic thoroughness of someone trained in tactical movement and terrain analysis. The team decided to attempt Elena's suggested approach, largely because the alternatives were either too dangerous or too time-consuming given the injured child's condition. As they began the difficult traverse through dense timber and unstable terrain, Elena found herself naturally taking the lead, choosing the safest paths and identifying potential hazards with an expertise that couldn't be explained by casual hiking experience. "Stay away from that area," she warned at one point, directing the team around what appeared to be solid ground. "The drainage pattern suggests it's probably unstable. Better to go around." Her prediction proved accurate when they heard a small landslide occur in the exact area she'd identified as dangerous. Tom and Jake were beginning to realize that their volunteer colleague possessed considerably more outdoor expertise than she'd ever mentioned. When they finally reached the trapped hikers, Elena's medical knowledge became impossible to hide. The Injured child showed signs of a concussion, and Elena conducted a neurological assessment with the systematic precision of someone with advanced medical training. She checked pupil response, tested coordination, and asked diagnostic questions that revealed the extent of the injury. "He's got a moderate concussion," she told the anxious parents. "His symptoms are serious but not immediately life-threatening. We need to get him evacuated for proper medical evaluation, but he should be okay if we're careful during transport." The assessment was delivered with calm authority that reassured the family while providing clear direction for the rescue team. Elena then organized the evacuation with tactical efficiency, assigning specific roles to each person and establishing communication protocols that ensured coordinated movement back to safety. "How do you know all this medical stuff?" the child's father asked as Elena immobilized a suspected sprain on his wife's ankle. "First aid training," Elena replied, but her treatment techniques went well beyond basic first aid. She was applying advanced wilderness medicine protocols with a competence that suggested extensive field experience. The evacuation proceeded smoothly under Elena's guidance, but her leadership during the crisis raised new questions about her background. Jake and Tom observed her directing the operation with command presence that seemed natural and practiced. She anticipated problems before they developed, maintained situational awareness of changing conditions, and made tactical decisions with confidence that suggested extensive emergency response experience. "You've done this before," Jake said during a rest stop as they helped the family navigate a particularly challenging section of trail. It wasn't a question. Elena paused before answering. "Emergency situations have a way of bringing out capabilities you didn't know you had." But Jake wasn't convinced by the deflection. Elena's performance during the rescue operation had been too polished, too professional to be explained by natural talent or adrenaline-induced competence. She was operating with skills and knowledge that required extensive training and experience. When the rescue team finally reached safety, Elena quietly faded into the background as emergency medical technicians took over care of the injured family. She provided a brief report to Fire Chief Walsh about the child's condition and the circumstances of the rescue, then attempted to slip away before receiving too much attention for her role in the successful operation. But word of Elena's performance had already spread throughout the emergency response community. The county search and rescue coordinator, who had arrived just as the team returned, sought her out for a more detailed briefing. Captain Martinez was particularly interested in Elena's tactical approach to the rescue and her assessment of the terrain challenges. "That was textbook wilderness rescue methodology," Captain Martinez told Walsh after interviewing Elena. "Your volunteer has some serious training somewhere in her background. Those weren't amateur-level decisions she made up there." Walsh nodded thoughtfully. He'd been reaching the same conclusion based on Elena's consistent demonstrations of advanced knowledge and skills. The rescue operation had simply made it impossible to ignore the obvious. Elena Martinez was considerably more qualified than she'd ever admitted. The successful rescue generated positive attention for the Cedar Falls Fire Department, but it also created problems for Elena's carefully maintained anonymity. Local media coverage of the incident praised the volunteers' heroic efforts, and Elena found herself reluctantly included in interviews and recognition ceremonies that she would have preferred to avoid. Dr. Mitchell, who treated the rescued family at the clinic, made a point of thanking Elena for her medical assessment of the injured child. "Your field diagnosis was spot on," the doctor said. "The boy's concussion was exactly as you described, and your treatment during transport prevented complications. You've clearly had medical training beyond basic first aid." Elena accepted the praise graciously but deflected questions about her background with increasingly vague responses. She was beginning to realize that her cover story was becoming harder to maintain as more people observed her capabilities in action. The rescue operation marked a turning point in Elena's life in Cedar Falls, her competence could no longer be attributed to luck or general knowledge, and observant people were beginning to ask more pointed questions about her mysterious background. The careful balance she'd maintained for months was tilting toward exposure, and Elena knew that her peaceful existence in the small mountain town was living on borrowed time. But she'd also discovered something unexpected during the crisis, a sense of purpose and satisfaction that she'd been missing since her official death 8 years earlier. For the first time since disappearing, Elena felt like she was using her skills for something meaningful rather than just surviving. The realization created a conflict between her need for anonymity and her desire to continue serving the community that had accepted her. The radio call that would change everything was still approaching, but Elena's cover was already beginning to unravel under the weight of her own competence. In trying to help others, she was inadvertently revealing the very capabilities that she'd spent 8 years trying to hide. The increased scrutiny following the mountain rescue created an environment where Elena's every action was being observed and analyzed by people who were beginning to connect dots she'd hoped would remain invisible. The small town's informal network of information sharing, which had initially helped her blend in, was now working against her as residents compared notes about their mysteriously competent volunteer. Betty at Lou's Diner had become an unofficial clearinghouse for speculation about Elena's background. During the morning coffee rush, conversations increasingly turned to theories about what Elena had done before arriving in Cedar Falls. The successful rescue had elevated her from local curiosity to genuine mystery, and the town's residents were determined to solve the puzzle. "I'm telling you, she's got to be ex-military," insisted Frank Kowalski during one such discussion. The way she handled herself during that rescue, the equipment knowledge, her physical conditioning. "That's not civilian training, but military doing what?" asked Dr. Mitchell, who had joined the conversation. "Her medical knowledge is extensive, but it's specifically trauma and emergency medicine. That suggests field medic training, possibly special operations." Betty poured coffee while adding her own observations. "She's been getting mail addressed to 3 different first names since she moved here. Elena, Ellen, and once something that looked like Ellie. Could be family sending mail, but it's odd." The detail about varying names was new information that caused the group to exchange meaningful glances. In a small town where everyone knew everyone else's business, receiving mail under multiple names was definitely suspicious. Tom Rodriguez, who had participated in mountain rescue, contributed his own observations. "During the operation, she was constantly checking escape routes and monitoring our surroundings. Not just for weather or terrain hazards, but like she was watching for threats. That's tactical awareness, not hiking experience." These conversations were taking place throughout Cedar Falls, in the hardware store, at the post office, and during volunteer fire department meetings. Elena was becoming the subject of intense amateur investigation by well-meaning residents who were genuinely curious about someone they'd come to respect and appreciate. Fire Chief Walsh found himself fielding inquiries from other emergency response agencies who had heard about the successful rescue. The County Emergency Management Coordinator wanted to know more about the volunteer who had demonstrated such advanced capabilities. The State Search and Rescue Organization was interested in recruiting Elena for their specialized teams. "We'd like to interview your volunteer about joining our technical rescue unit," explained Captain Williams during a phone call to Walsh. "Her performance during the mountain incident suggests training that we could really use." "What's her background?" Walsh realized he couldn't answer the question with any confidence. Elena's volunteer application listed generic qualifications and previous employment that didn't explain her demonstrated competencies. He'd accepted her modest self-description at face value, but the rescue operation had revealed capabilities that demanded explanation. The chief decided to conduct his own quiet investigation, starting with Elena's references and employment history. But when he attempted to verify the information she'd provided, he encountered problems that raised more questions than they answered. The logistics company Elena claimed to have worked for existed, but their human resources department had no record of employing anyone named Elena Martinez during the time frame she'd specified. The address she'd listed as her previous residence corresponded to a legitimate apartment complex, but management couldn't confirm her tenancy without additional identification information that Elena hadn't provided. Walsh's attempts to verify Elena's certifications and training credentials yielded similar results. The organizations that had supposedly issued her qualifications had no records matching her stated credentials. It was possible that the discrepancies resulted from administrative errors or changes in record-keeping systems, but the pattern was troubling. Meanwhile, Elena was becoming increasingly aware that her background was under scrutiny. She noticed the subtle changes in how people interacted with her, the slightly longer pauses before they accepted her explanations, and the more pointed questions about her experience and qualifications. Mike Sterling, the department's communications coordinator, had been particularly persistent in his inquiries about Elena's radio expertise. During a routine equipment maintenance session, he'd tested her knowledge with increasingly technical questions that revealed the depth of her communications training. "You know about frequency hopping and encryption protocols," Mike observed, after Elena had explained how to troubleshoot interference on their tactical frequencies. "That's not amateur radio knowledge. Where did you learn about secure communications?" Elena had deflected the question with a reference to online research and technical manuals, but Mike wasn't satisfied with the explanation. He'd worked in military communications for 12 years before retiring to Cedar Falls, and he recognized professional-level expertise when he encountered it. The pressure of maintaining her cover story under increased scrutiny was beginning to affect Elena's behavior. She became more cautious about demonstrating her knowledge, more selective about when to offer assistance, and more conscious of how her actions might be interpreted by observant colleagues. But her attempts to dial back her competence created new problems. During a training exercise involving search patterns, Elena deliberately avoided suggesting improvements to the team's approach, even though she could see obvious inefficiencies that could compromise a real rescue operation. Her restraint was noticed by experienced volunteers who had come to rely on her insights. "Elena's been quiet lately," Jake mentioned to Tom after a training session where Elena had remained largely silent despite obvious opportunities to contribute. "Usually she spots things we miss. Today she seemed like she was holding back." The observation was accurate. Elena was indeed holding back, trying to reduce her visibility while the community conducted its informal investigation of her background. But her withdrawal from active participation was as conspicuous as her previous demonstrations of expertise had been. "Lisa," Sean approached Elena directly about the change in her behavior. "Is everything okay?" she asked after a first aid refresher. Where Elena had avoided answering questions, she clearly knew the answers to. "You seem distracted lately." Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Elena assured Lisa that everything was fine, explaining that she was dealing with some personal issues that were affecting her focus. It was a plausible excuse that Lisa accepted, but it didn't address the underlying concerns about Elena's true qualifications and background. The investigation took a more serious turn when Walsh decided to contact federal authorities about his volunteers' questionable credentials. He wasn't suspicious of Elena's intentions, but the discrepancies in her background information raised legitimate security concerns for someone with access to emergency communication systems and community infrastructure. The inquiry was routine and discreet, but it set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately expose Elena's carefully constructed identity. Federal databases that civilian employers couldn't access contained information that painted a very different picture of who Elena Martinez really was. Agent Sarah Cooper from the FBI's regional office received Walsh's inquiry and conducted a preliminary background check that immediately raised red flags. The Social Security number Elena had provided belonged to a real person, but that person had died in a car accident 5 years earlier. The birth certificate and driver's license she'd used to establish her identity were sophisticated forgeries that had passed casual scrutiny, but couldn't withstand federal investigation. More troubling was what Agent Cooper found when she ran Elena's photograph through facial recognition systems. The woman living in Cedar Falls as Elena Martinez bore a striking resemblance to someone whose file was flagged with national security classifications that required special clearance to access. Cooper made a secure phone call to her supervisor in Washington, describing the situation and requesting guidance on how to proceed. The response was immediate and emphatic. Maintain surveillance but take no action without explicit authorization from higher authorities. This case is above your clearance level, Cooper's supervisor explained. There are ongoing national security considerations that complicate any law enforcement action. Monitor the subject but do not approach or attempt to apprehend without direct orders. The federal interest in Elena's case remained invisible to the Cedar Falls community, but it represented a significant escalation in the investigation of her background. For the first time in 8 years, Elena's new identity was being scrutinized by authorities with the resources and access necessary to uncover the truth. Elena remained unaware of the federal investigation, but she could sense that the informal scrutiny from her neighbors and colleagues was intensifying. She began making subtle preparations for the possibility that she might need to relocate again, updating emergency travel documents and identifying secure communication methods that would allow her to establish a new identity elsewhere. The irony wasn't lost on her that her desire to help the community had created the very exposure she'd spent years trying to avoid. The successful mountain rescue had demonstrated capabilities that couldn't be explained by her cover story, and curious residents were determined to understand how their quiet volunteer had acquired such advanced skills. But Elena had also discovered something during her time in Cedar Falls that made the prospect of disappearing again particularly difficult. For the first time since her official death, she'd found a place where she felt genuinely useful and appreciated. The volunteer work provided meaning and purpose that she'd been missing, and the relationships she'd formed with her colleagues felt authentic in ways her previous existence hadn't allowed. The approaching crisis that would force her to reveal her true identity was still unknown to Elena, but the foundation for that revelation was already being established through the community's investigation of her background and the federal authorities' growing interest in her case. The peaceful anonymity she'd maintained for 8 years was eroding from multiple directions, and Elena was running out of ways to deflect the increasingly pointed questions about who she really was. Dr. Mitchell had begun keeping informal notes about Elena's medical knowledge, documenting instances where her expertise exceeded what civilian first aid training could explain. Frank Kowalski was quietly checking with other hardware store owners in the region to see if anyone recognized Elena from previous employment. Mike Sterling was researching communications training programs to understand where Elena might have acquired her technical knowledge. The collective investigation was conducted with genuine affection and respect for Elena, but it was also systematically dismantling the carefully constructed fiction that had allowed her to live quietly in Cedar Falls. Each new piece of information contradicted her stated background, and the accumulating evidence was pointing toward conclusions that would soon become impossible to ignore. The stage was being set for a confrontation between Elena's need for anonymity and the community's determination to understand who they had been working alongside for the past 8 months. The radio call that would force everything into the open was approaching, but Elena's secret was already under assault from multiple directions by people who cared about her enough to demand the truth, the crisis that would shatter Elena's carefully Maintained anonymity began at 3:47 a.m. on a frigid December morning when a charter bus carrying 32 college students skidded off the icy mountain highway 20 miles north of Cedar Falls. The bus had been returning from a skiing trip when black ice sent it careening through a guardrail and down a steep embankment, where it came to rest precariously balanced against a cluster of pine trees that prevented it from rolling into the ravine below. Elena was awakened by her emergency scanner crackling with desperate radio calls from the first responders who had arrived at the scene. The initial reports painted a grim picture: multiple casualties, difficult access, and a vehicle that could shift position at any moment. Worse, a winter storm was moving in rapidly, bringing heavy snow that would make rescue operations exponentially more dangerous within hours. Multiple trauma patients, estimate 15 to 20 serious injuries, reported the first paramedic on scene. Vehicle is unstable, positioned on steep terrain. We need specialized rescue equipment and additional medical personnel immediately. Elena lay in her bed listening to the radio traffic, her mind automatically processing the tactical challenges the responders were facing. The accident location was in a remote section of highway where cell phone coverage was sporadic and radio communication was limited by terrain features. The nearest hospital was 40 minutes away under ideal conditions, and current weather was making transportation increasingly difficult. County search and rescue is responding but won't arrive for at least 2 hours, the incident commander reported. State police helicopters grounded due to weather conditions. We're on our own for initial response. The volunteer fire departments from 3 communities were being mobilized, but Elena could tell from the radio chatter that the responders were overwhelmed by the scope of the emergency. They needed someone with experience managing mass casualty incidents and technical rescue operations, but the qualified personnel were either unavailable or too far away to help. Elena dressed quickly and drove to the Cedar Falls fire station, where she found organized chaos as volunteers prepared for what would be the most challenging operation in the department's history. Chief Walsh was coordinating with multiple agencies while volunteers loaded equipment onto trucks with desperate urgency. "Elena, thank God you're here," Walsh called out when he saw her. "We need every qualified person we can get. This is way beyond anything we've dealt with before." She surveyed the preparation efforts and immediately identified problems that could compromise the rescue operation. The equipment being loaded was appropriate for routine emergencies, but inadequate for technical rescue in challenging terrain. The medical supplies were insufficient for treating multiple trauma patients. Most critically, the communication plan didn't account for the terrain limitations that would interfere with radio coordination. "Chief, we need to revise the equipment loadout," Elena said, stepping forward with authority that surprised everyone in the room. "Based on the location description, we're going to need rope rescue gear, additional medical supplies for trauma patients, and backup communication systems." Walsh looked at her with new attention. "What do you recommend?" Elena began systematically reorganizing the equipment selection, demonstrating familiarity with technical rescue gear that went far beyond volunteer fire department training. She selected specific rope configurations for steep terrain operations, identified medical supplies needed for field triage, and specified communication equipment that would maintain contact in challenging environments. "How do you know all this?" asked Jake, watching Elena work with obvious expertise. "We don't have time for explanations," Elena replied, continuing her equipment assessment. "Those students are injured and the weather's getting worse. We need to move now with the right gear." Her urgency and competence convinced the volunteers to follow her recommendations without further questions. Within 20 minutes, the trucks were loaded with equipment that Elena had configured for the specific challenges they would face. But her leadership during the preparation phase had revealed knowledge and skills that couldn't be explained by her stated background. The convoy of emergency vehicles made its way, through deteriorating weather conditions toward the accident site. Elena rode with the rescue team, using the travel time to brief volunteers on tactical considerations they would encounter. Her analysis of the situation was comprehensive and professional, covering everything from patient triage protocols to terrain hazards. "Vehicle stability is going to be our primary concern," she explained to the team. "Any movement could shift the bus position and endanger both patients and rescuers. We need to establish anchor points and stabilization before anyone approaches the vehicle." Tom Rodriguez, who was driving, glanced at Elena in the rearview mirror. "You sound like you've done this before." Elena met his eyes but didn't answer. Directly, emergency situations require systematic thinking. We need to be prepared for complications. When they arrived at the accident scene, Elena's worst fears were confirmed. The charter bus was wedged against trees on a steep slope, with its front end hanging over a drop-off that disappeared into darkness. Emergency lights illuminated a scene of controlled chaos as paramedics treated injured students while trying to avoid destabilizing the precariously balanced vehicle. The incident commander, Captain Rodriguez from the County Sheriff's Department, was struggling to coordinate rescue efforts with insufficient personnel and equipment. When he saw the Cedar Falls volunteers arrive, his relief was evident. "We've got 23 students still trapped inside the bus," he reported to Chief Walsh. 8 have been evacuated with serious injuries. The vehicle's position is critical. Any significant movement could send it over the edge. Elena surveyed the scene with practiced assessment, mentally cataloging the tactical challenges and developing operational priorities. Her analysis was based on experience with far more complex rescue operations, but she forced herself to frame her observations in terms that wouldn't reveal the depth of her training. "We need to stabilize the vehicle before continuing evacuation," she told Walsh. "And we need to establish a proper patient staging area away from the hazard zone." But as Elena watched the rescue efforts, she realized that the responders lacked the specialized knowledge needed to manage such a complex operation safely. Students were still trapped in the most dangerous section of the bus, and the improvised rescue techniques being employed were actually increasing the risk of vehicle movement. The moment of decision came when a teenage girl trapped in the rear of the bus began showing signs of serious internal bleeding. The paramedics couldn't reach her safely without risking the vehicle's stability, and her condition was deteriorating rapidly. Someone needed to enter the bus and provide immediate medical intervention, but the operation required technical rescue, skills that none of the available responders possessed. "I can reach her," Elena announced, stepping forward with equipment she'd selected from the rescue truck. Captain Rodriguez shook his head. "Ma'am, that's extremely dangerous. We're waiting for specialized rescue teams with proper training." "She'd be dead by the time they arrive," Elena replied, checking her rappelling gear with movements that revealed extensive technical rescue experience. "I can stabilize her condition and establish an evacuation route." "Do you have technical rescue certification?" Rodriguez demanded. Elena paused, realizing that answering truthfully would expose capabilities she'd hidden for 8 years. But the girl in the bus was running out of time, and Elena couldn't stand by while someone died because she was afraid of revealing her background. "I have the training necessary to perform this rescue," she said carefully. Before anyone could stop her, Elena had rigged anchor points and begun a controlled descent toward the unstable bus. Her movements were fluid and confident, demonstrating technical climbing skills that clearly surprised the watching responders. She entered the vehicle through a rear window and immediately began medical assessment of the trapped student. "Patient has probable internal bleeding and possible spinal injury," she reported over her radio using medical terminology that exceeded basic first aid knowledge. "I'm going to stabilize her for evacuation and establish a secure extraction point." What followed was a textbook demonstration of technical rescue and emergency medicine that left no Doubt about Elena's professional qualifications. She immobilized the injured student using advanced trauma protocols, rigged an evacuation system that minimized risk to both patient and rescuers, and coordinated the extraction with precision that spoke of extensive field experience. "Who is that woman?" Captain Rodriguez asked Chief Walsh as they watched Elena work with obvious expertise. Walsh shook his head slowly. "I'm beginning to think I have no idea." Elena's successful extraction of the critically injured student was followed by the systematic evacuation of the remaining trapped passengers. She directed the operation with command authority that the other responders instinctively followed, implementing safety protocols and coordination procedures that ensured efficient patient evacuation without vehicle destabilization. By the time county search and rescue teams arrived on scene, Elena had managed the evacuation of all trapped students and established a medical staging area where paramedics could provide appropriate treatment. Her performance during the operation had been flawless, but it had also revealed capabilities that demanded explanation. "Outstanding work," the search and rescue team leader told Elena after being briefed on the operation. "That was professional-level technical rescue. Where did you receive your training?" Elena was cleaning equipment when the question was asked, and she paused for a long moment before answering. "Experience teaches you what works." But the evasive response no longer satisfied anyone who had witnessed her performance. Elena had demonstrated expertise that required years of specialized training and extensive field experience. Her knowledge of technical rescue, emergency medicine, and incident command couldn't be explained by volunteer fire department participation or online research. Dr. Mitchell, who had responded to treat the evacuated patients, approached Elena with obvious curiosity. "Your medical assessment and treatment were exceptional. The girl you extracted would have died without immediate intervention. Your trauma protocols were exactly what a flight medic would have done." The comment hung in the air as Elena realized that her cover story had become completely unsustainable. Too many qualified observers had witnessed capabilities that couldn't be explained by civilian training. The secret she'd protected for 8 years was finally exposed by her inability to watch people suffer when she had the skills to help them. As dawn broke over the accident scene and the last patients were transported to area hospitals, Elena found herself surrounded by responders who wanted to understand who they had been working alongside. The successful rescue operation had saved lives, but it had also shattered the carefully constructed anonymity that had allowed Elena Martinez to exist. The radio call that would reveal her true identity was still hours away, but Elena's cover was already blown beyond recovery. Her performance during the bus accident had demonstrated professional qualifications that couldn't be hidden or explained away. The people of Cedar Falls were about to discover that their quiet volunteer possessed capabilities that belonged to someone with a very different background than anything Elena had ever claimed. The aftermath of the bus rescue created an atmosphere of intense scrutiny that Elena could no longer navigate with deflection and modest explanations. As news of the successful operation spread through the emergency response community, her performance became the subject of detailed analysis by professionals who recognized expertise when they saw it. Captain Sarah Chun from the State Search and Rescue Unit had arrived just as the evacuation was being completed, but she'd observed enough to understand that the operation had been managed by someone with exceptional qualifications. When she attempted to debrief Elena about the rescue techniques employed, the conversation quickly revealed knowledge that extended far beyond civilian emergency response training. "Your anchor point configuration was textbook technical rescue," Captain Chun observed, examining the rope systems Elena had rigged. "The load distribution and backup protocols you used are taught in advanced courses that require military or professional rescue certification. Where did you complete your technical rescue training?" Elena found herself cornered by increasingly specific questions that she couldn't answer without revealing her true background. her usual deflections about online research and general interest. In emergency procedures sounded hollow when discussing complex technical systems that required hands-on training to master. "I've always been interested in rescue techniques," Elena replied, but even she could hear how inadequate the explanation sounded. Captain Chin wasn't satisfied. "This level of proficiency requires years of training and field experience. You performed under extreme pressure with precision that suggests extensive operational background. I need to know your qualifications for my incident report." The pressure was mounting from multiple directions as other officials demanded explanations for Elena's capabilities. The county emergency management coordinator wanted to understand how a volunteer with no official rescue certification had successfully managed such a complex operation. The hospital administrators were asking questions about Elena's medical assessments, which had proven remarkably accurate despite her lack of formal medical credentials. Dr. Patricia Williams, the trauma surgeon who had treated the most seriously injured students, sought out Elena specifically to discuss her field medical work. "Your patient assessment was exceptional," Dr. Williams said. "The girl you extracted presented with exactly the injuries you identified during your initial evaluation. Your treatment protocols prevented complications that could have been fatal. That's not volunteer first aid training." Elena tried to maintain her composure under the intense professional scrutiny, but she was running out of plausible explanations for her demonstrated competencies. Each conversation revealed additional aspects of her training that couldn't be reconciled with her stated background. As a logistics worker with basic emergency response interest, the breaking point came when Agent Sarah Cooper from the FBI arrived at the accident scene, ostensibly to investigate whether the bus crash involved any federal safety violations. But Cooper's real interest was in Elena Martinez, whose performance during the rescue had confirmed the suspicions that had been building since Chief Walsh's background inquiry weeks earlier. Cooper approached Elena with the practiced casualness of someone conducting a surveillance assessment rather than a routine interview. "Ms. Martinez, I'm Agent Cooper with the FBI. I'd like to ask you a few questions about the rescue operation for our incident documentation." Elena recognized the interview for what it really was, an interrogation designed to test her cover story. Under professional scrutiny, Cooper's questions were carefully crafted to elicit responses that would reveal inconsistencies in Elena's background narrative. "Your technical rescue skills are quite impressive," Cooper observed. "Most civilian volunteers don't have training in complex rope systems and high-angle rescue. Where did you acquire these capabilities?" Elena felt the walls closing in around her carefully constructed identity. Cooper's questions were too pointed, too informed to be routine incident documentation. Someone had been investigating her background, and the bus rescue had provided confirmation of suspicions that Elena hadn't even known existed. "I've always been interested in emergency response techniques," Elena replied, but she could see that Cooper wasn't accepting the standard deflection that had worked with others. Cooper consulted her notes before asking the next question. "Our records indicate some discrepancies in your background information. The logistics company you listed as previous employment has no record of your employment during the specified time frame. Could you help clarify that discrepancy?" The direct challenge to her cover story marked the moment when Elena realized that her carefully maintained anonymity was completely compromised. Federal authorities had been investigating her background and had discovered the fabricated elements of her identity. The successful rescue operation had simply provided the final confirmation they needed. Elena looked around at the emergency responders who were still working at the accident scene, people who had come to trust and respect her contributions to their community. The thought of disappointing them by revealing that everything they knew about her was fabricated was almost as difficult as facing the consequences of exposure. "Agent Cooper," Elena said quietly, "I think we should continue this conversation privately." But before Cooper could respond, the radio on Elena's belt crackled with an emergency transmission that changed everything. The voice coming through. The static was professional and urgent, but what made Elena's blood run cold was the call sign being used. Any station, any station. This is November 7 Alpha requesting immediate emergency assistance. We have aircraft down with multiple casualties in the wilderness area north of Cedar Falls. Medical evacuation required. Immediately, Elena froze. As she recognized not just the voice, but the specific call sign format that belonged to a classified military unit she knew wasn't supposed to exist anymore. November 7 Alpha was the tactical designation for a special operations team that had been officially disbanded 8 years earlier following a mission that had gone catastrophically wrong. Agent Cooper was watching Elena's reaction carefully. When the follow-up transmission came through, any qualified medical personnel in the area, we have critical casualties requiring immediate trauma intervention. GPS coordinates follow. Elena's mind raced as she processed the implications. If November 7 Alpha was operating in the area, it meant that either classified military operations were still ongoing despite official denials, or someone was using stolen call signs for purposes she couldn't immediately determine. Either possibility represented a threat that required immediate investigation. That's an unusual call sign, Cooper observed, studying Elena's face for reactions. Do you recognize the format? Elena realized that Cooper was testing her knowledge of military communication protocols, looking for responses that would confirm suspicions about her true background. But the emergency transmission had created a situation where Elena specialized. Knowledge might be essential for saving lives. Agent Cooper, Elena said carefully, that call sign belongs to a military unit that was officially disbanded 8 years ago. Either someone's using stolen identification codes, or there's a classified operation happening that civilians shouldn't know about. Cooper's expression sharpened with interest. How do you know about military call sign protocols? The question hung in the air as Elena faced the impossible choice between maintaining her cover and revealing information that could be crucial for responding to the emergency. The radio continued to crackle with increasingly desperate calls for assistance from November 7 Alpha, and Elena could hear the stress in the operator's voice as he repeated requests for medical evacuation. Because, Elena said, making a decision that would end 8 years of carefully maintained anonymity, I used to be part of that unit before it was officially disbanded. My real name isn't Elena Martinez. The admission created a moment of stunned silence among the emergency responders who had gathered around to listen to the unusual radio traffic. Elena's revelation that she had military connections to the mysterious call sign transformed the entire dynamic of the situation. Agent Cooper immediately became more focused and professional. What's your real name and military service record? Elena looked around at the faces of people who had become friends and colleagues over the past 8 months, knowing that everything was about to change irrevocably. Staff Sergeant Maria Elena Santos, formerly attached to Special Operations Command, officially killed in action 8 years ago during Operation Silent Thunder. The name caused Agent Cooper to step back in surprise. She immediately reached for her secure communication device, placing a priority call to federal authorities who would need to be informed about the situation immediately. Chief Walsh, who had been listening to the exchange with growing confusion, spoke up. Elena, what's going on? You're saying you're not who you told us you were? Chief, I'm sorry for the deception, Elena replied, her voice heavy with emotion. I had to disappear 8 years ago for reasons I still can't fully explain. But right now there are people in trouble who need help, and I might be the only person in the area qualified to provide it. The radio transmission from November 7 Alpha continued, with increasingly urgent requests for medical assistance and evacuation support. Elena could tell from the communication pattern that the Situation was deteriorating rapidly and that conventional emergency response wouldn't be adequate for whatever crisis was developing. "Agent Cooper," Elena said, "I need to respond to that. Emergency call. If November 7 Alpha is really operating in this area, those personnel are in serious danger, and they need immediate assistance from someone who understands their protocols and capabilities." Cooper was still processing the implications of Elena's revealed identity when her secure phone rang with a call from Washington. The conversation was brief and intense, with Cooper providing Elena's real name and requesting immediate guidance on how to proceed. When Cooper ended the call, her demeanor had changed completely. "Sergeant Santos, I've been instructed to provide you with full cooperation for responding to this emergency. Your knowledge of the unit's operational procedures may be essential for coordination with federal response teams." Elena felt a mixture of relief and apprehension as she realized that her cover was blown beyond recovery, but that her specialized knowledge was still needed for the developing crisis. The peaceful anonymity she'd maintained in Cedar Falls was ending, but the skills that had forced her into hiding were once again required for saving lives. "Chief Walsh," Elena said, turning to address her fire department colleagues, "I know this is confusing and I owe all of you a full explanation. But right now, there are people in serious trouble, and I'm probably the only person in the area. Who can help them?" The emergency radio continued to crackle with calls from November 7 Alpha, and Elena could hear the increasing desperation in the transmissions. Whatever was happening in the wilderness north of Cedar Falls was escalating beyond conventional emergency response capabilities, and Elena's unique background might be the key to preventing a disaster, the moment she had spent 8 years trying to avoid had finally arrived, but it was coming in circumstances she had never anticipated. Her carefully constructed new life was crumbling, but the skills and experience that had forced her disappearance were once again desperately needed. Elena's hands moved with practiced precision as she adjusted the radio equipment in the fire department's command vehicle, fine-tuning frequencies and implementing secure communication protocols that she hadn't used in 8 years. The muscle memory was still there, ingrained by thousands of hours of training in field operations that had made radio communication as natural as breathing. "November 7 Alpha. This is Phoenix 7 responding to your emergency transmission." Elena spoke into the microphone, using the call sign that she thought she would never use again. "Report your status and location for immediate assistance." The response was immediate and filled with relief. "Phoenix 7, confirmed authentication. We have aircraft down approximately 15 miles north of Cedar Falls. Coordinates 3-7-2-point-5-5-9 by -11-5-point-8-8-2. Multiple casualties, including critical trauma requiring immediate surgical intervention." Agent Cooper was listening intently as Elena established contact with the downed military unit. The authentication protocols being used confirmed that both Elena and the November 7 Alpha team were legitimate military personnel, not civilians using stolen call signs. Cooper immediately initiated a secure call to coordinate with military command. Authorities. Elena continued her radio communication while simultaneously analyzing the tactical situation. "November 7 Alpha, what is your mission status and available resources? Do you have secure landing zone for medical evacuation?" "Negative on secure, LZ, Phoenix 7. Aircraft sustained catastrophic failure during insertion. We have engineering personnel attempting to establish emergency communications with command, but primary mission is compromised. Require immediate medical evacuation for 3 critical casualties." Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel, Chief Walsh and the other Cedar Falls Volunteers listened in fascination as Elena conducted a professional military briefing that revealed the depth of training they had never suspected. Her communication style, terminology, and tactical awareness demonstrated expertise that belonged to someone with extensive special operations experience. November 7 Alpha, I'm coordinating with local emergency response and federal authorities for immediate assistance, Elena transmitted. What are your defensive preparations and security requirements? The question revealed Elena's understanding that the downed team might be operating in hostile territory or conducting classified missions that required operational security measures. Agent Cooper was taking detailed notes about the communication, preparing to brief higher authorities about the developing situation. Phoenix 7, we have established defensive perimeter and are maintaining operational security protocols. Mission classification requires federal coordination for any civilian response. Can you facilitate appropriate clearance levels? Elena looked at Agent Cooper, who nodded and took control of coordinating with federal authorities. November 7. Alpha, federal representatives are on site and coordinating appropriate response. Phoenix 7 will provide tactical liaison for emergency medical intervention. What Elena didn't reveal over the radio was her growing concern about why November 7 Alpha was operating in the area at all. The unit had been disbanded following Operation Silent Thunder, the mission that had officially killed Elena and several other team members 8 years earlier. If the unit was still active, it meant that either the disbandment had been fictional or new personnel had been assigned to continue the classified work. Dr. Williams, who had remained at the accident scene to coordinate patient transfers, approached Elena with medical equipment. If you're going to respond to this emergency, you'll need proper trauma supplies. Based on what I heard over the radio, you're dealing with serious casualties. Elena accepted the medical kit while mentally cataloging the supplies she would need for treating combat injuries and field conditions. Her medical training had been extensive, covering everything from basic first aid to advanced trauma surgery that could be performed without hospital facilities. Agent Cooper, I need to know what authority I have for this operation, Elena said. If November 7 Alpha is conducting classified missions, there may be operational security requirements that complicate civilian emergency response. Cooper had been receiving updates through her secure communication device and was clearly coordinating with authorities at the highest levels. Sergeant Santos, you're being temporarily reactivated for this operation under federal emergency authority. You have full authorization to coordinate medical response and tactical liaison. The reactivation was both liberating and terrifying for Elena. After 8 years of hiding her identity and suppressing her training, she was being officially acknowledged and authorized to use the skills that had defined her military career. But reactivation also meant exposure to the same threats that had forced her disappearance in the first place. Elena began organizing the emergency response with military efficiency that impressed the watching civilians. She coordinated with Chief Walsh to provide transportation and support personnel, briefed Agent Cooper on tactical considerations for approaching the crash site, and established communication protocols that would maintain operational security while facilitating rescue operations. Chief, I need your best off-road vehicle and 3 volunteers with wilderness experience, Elena instructed. We're going into difficult terrain to extract casualties, and I'll need support personnel who can function effectively under stress. Jake Morrison immediately volunteered, along with Tom Rodriguez and Lisa Chun. They had worked with Elena during previous emergencies and trusted her leadership. Even though they were still processing the revelation of her true identity and military background. As the rescue team prepared to depart, Elena found herself switching between her civilian persona and her military training in ways that felt both natural and strange. For 8 years, she had suppressed the tactical thinking and command presence that had made her effective in special operations. Now those capabilities were flooding back as she faced a crisis that required every skill she possessed. "Jake, Tom, Lisa," Elena addressed her volunteer colleagues. "What we're about to do is potentially dangerous and definitely classified. You'll be supporting a military operation that officially doesn't exist. Are you willing to accept those risks?" The three volunteers exchanged glances before Jake answered for the group. "Elena, or whoever you really are, we've worked with you for months. We trust your judgment and we want to help save lives. That's what we signed up for when we became volunteers." Elena felt a surge of emotion at their loyalty and confidence, even after learning that everything they thought they knew about her was fabricated. The relationships she had built in Cedar Falls were genuine, even if her identity had been false. The rescue team loaded equipment into the fire department's most capable off-road vehicle while Elena continued radio coordination with November 7 Alpha. The downed team was providing regular status updates that painted an increasingly urgent picture of medical needs and tactical complications. "Phoenix 7, we have one casualty requiring immediate surgical intervention for internal bleeding. Second casualty has compound fractures and possible spinal injury. Third casualty is stable, but requires evacuation for comprehensive medical evaluation." Elena mentally prioritized the medical requirements while planning the tactical approach to the crash site. Her training had prepared her for exactly this type of operation: emergency medical intervention in hostile or unsecured territory with limited resources and time constraints. Agent Cooper joined the rescue team, bringing federal communication equipment that would allow coordination with military command authorities. "Sergeant Santos, I've been authorized to accompany this operation as federal representative. Command wants real-time updates on the situation." The convoy departed Cedar Falls in deteriorating weather conditions that would make the rescue operation significantly more challenging. Snow was falling heavily, and mountain roads were becoming increasingly treacherous. Elena drove with the confident aggression of someone accustomed to operating in adverse conditions, maintaining speed and control that impressed her passengers. "You've definitely done this before," Tom observed as Elena navigated a particularly difficult section of mountain road. "This isn't volunteer fire department driving." Elena allowed herself a slight smile. "Some skills transfer better than others." As they approached the coordinates provided by November 7 Alpha, Elena began implementing operational security measures that revealed the depth of her tactical training. She established radio check-in procedures, coordinated approach routes that minimized exposure, and briefed the team on security protocols that would protect both the rescue personnel and the downed military unit. "Remember, what we see and hear during this operation is classified," Elena reminded her team. "November 7 Alpha is conducting sensitive missions that require operational security. We provide medical assistance and extraction support, but we don't ask questions about their activities." The crash site appeared through the snow as a scattered debris field where a military helicopter had apparently suffered catastrophic mechanical failure during a covert insertion mission. November 7 Alpha personnel had established a defensive perimeter around the wreckage while treating casualties with field medical equipment. Elena exited the vehicle and immediately assumed command of the medical response with authority that the military personnel recognized and accepted. Her approach to the casualties demonstrated advanced trauma medicine training that went far beyond standard military medical qualification. "Sergeant Santos, Phoenix 7, reporting for medical support," Elena announced to the November 7 Alpha team leader, using military protocol that felt both familiar and strange after 8 years of civilian life. The team leader, a seasoned Special Operations veteran, studied Elena's face with recognition. "Phoenix 7, good to see you again. We heard you were KIA during Silent Thunder." Elena's response revealed the complexity of her situation. "Officially, I still am. This is a temporary activation for emergency medical support." as Elena began, treating the most critical casualty, her hands moving with surgical precision, learned through years of combat medicine training. She realized that her 8 years of hiding were definitively over. The radio call that had forced her to reveal her identity had led to an operation that would make her visible to military command authorities who thought she was dead. The rescue operation was about to test every skill Elena had developed during her military career, but it was also going to expose her to the same threats that had forced her disappearance in the first place. Phoenix 7 was flying again, but this time there might be no place left to hide when the mission was complete. Her carefully constructed civilian life in Cedar Falls was ending, but Elena was discovering that some callings were stronger than the desire for peaceful anonymity. When lives hung in the balance, she couldn't remain invisible. Regardless of the personal consequences, Elena dropped to her knees beside the most critically injured soldier, her hands immediately beginning the systematic assessment that had saved countless lives during her special operations career. The casualty was a young communications specialist who had taken shrapnel to the abdomen during the helicopter crash, and his condition was deteriorating rapidly despite the field medical treatment his teammates had provided. "Talk to me, Elena," said to the team medic who had been treating the wounded soldier. "What's his status and what interventions have you attempted?" Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, the unit's senior medic, briefed Elena with professional efficiency. "Multiple penetrating wounds to the abdomen, probable internal bleeding, blood pressure dropping despite 4 fluids. We've controlled external bleeding, but suspect internal damage requiring surgical intervention." Elena's hands moved with practiced precision as she examined the patient, her training allowing her to assess injury severity and treatment priorities within seconds. The wounds were serious but treatable if she could stabilize the soldier for evacuation to a proper medical facility. The challenge was performing emergency surgery in field conditions with improvised equipment. "I need better lighting and a sterile work area," Elena announced, beginning to organize the medical supplies she had brought from Cedar Falls. "We're going to have to open him up here to control the bleeding." The November 7 Alpha team leader, Captain Williams, watched Elena work with obvious relief. "Phoenix 7, how long since you've performed combat surgery?" Elena's hands never paused in their preparation. 8 years, but some skills don't fade. "Your man's going to make it, but I need everyone to follow my instructions exactly." Jake, Morrison and Tom Rodriguez, the Cedar Falls volunteers who had accompanied Elena, found themselves assisting with medical procedures that went far beyond anything they had imagined when they volunteered for fire department duty. Elena's transformation from quiet volunteer to combat surgeon was complete and impressive. "Jake, I need you to maintain pressure on this wound while I work on the primary injury," Elena instructed, guiding his hands to the proper position. "Tom, monitor his pulse and respiratory rate. Call out any changes immediately." Lisa Chun, the EMT coordinator from Cedar Falls, was documenting Elena's medical procedures with fascination and professional respect. The surgical techniques Elena was employing were advanced trauma protocols that required extensive training and experience to perform safely. Elena made the decision to perform emergency surgery under field conditions, using techniques she had learned during special operations, training for treating casualties when evacuation to medical facilities wasn't possible. Her incision was precise and confident, revealing the internal damage while minimizing additional trauma. "Found it," Elena announced as she located the source of internal bleeding. "Shrapnel nicked the splenic artery. I can repair this, but it's going to take time." Agent Cooper was maintaining communication with federal authorities while observing Elena's medical work. The surgical competence Elena was demonstrating confirmed intelligence assessments about her advanced training and operational experience. Cooper was also coordinating with military command to arrange proper medical evacuation once Elena stabilized the casualties. The surgical repair required Elena to work with instruments improvised from her medical kit and tools borrowed from the November 7 Alpha team's equipment. Her suturing technique was flawless despite the challenging conditions, and her ability to maintain sterile procedures in a wilderness environment impressed even the experienced special operations medics. Blood pressure stabilizing, Tom reported, monitoring the patient's vital signs under Elena's direction. Pulse is stronger and more regular. Elena continued working with intense concentration, repairing internal damage while simultaneously monitoring the patient's overall condition. The surgery was complicated by the field conditions and limited equipment, but her training had prepared her for exactly these circumstances. While Elena operated on the most critical casualty, the November 7 Alpha team was dealing with tactical complications that required their attention. The helicopter crash had compromised their primary mission, and they were receiving encrypted communications from command authorities about potential threats in the area. Phoenix 7, Captain Williams called out. We're getting intel about possible hostile activity in the region. How much longer do you need for the surgery? Elena looked up from her work briefly. 20 minutes for completion, then he'll be stable for evacuation. What's the threat assessment? Williams consulted his encrypted communication device before responding. Unknown actors may be responding to our crash site. We need to be prepared for potential contact. The information added urgency to Elena's surgical work, but she maintained her methodical approach to the medical procedure. Her military training had taught her to function effectively under pressure, and the possibility of hostile contact was a complication she had dealt with during previous operations. Agent Cooper was coordinating with multiple federal agencies to arrange secure evacuation for both the military casualties and the civilian volunteers who had assisted with the rescue. The involvement of Cedar Falls personnel in a classified military operation created complex security considerations that required careful management. Elena completed the surgical repair and began preparing the patient for evacuation, applying surgical dressings and establishing IV lines that would maintain his condition during transport. Her work had been successful, and the soldier's vital signs showed marked improvement. Surgery complete, patient stable for transport, Elena announced. Moving to assess the second casualty. Let's see what we're dealing with here. The second injured soldier had sustained compound fractures to both legs during the crash, along with possible spinal injuries that required careful stabilization before evacuation. Elena's assessment was thorough and professional, identifying treatment priorities that would ensure safe transport without additional injury. We need spinal immobilization and traction splinting for the leg fractures, Elena told Lisa Chun, who was assisting with the medical care. His neurological function appears intact, but we can't take chances with spinal injury. The medical treatment continued with Elena demonstrating the advanced trauma care that had made her valuable during special operations missions. Her ability to perform complex medical procedures under field conditions was exactly the capability that November 7 Alpha needed for treating their casualties. Captain Williams approached Elena as she worked on the second patient. Phoenix 7, Command wants to debrief you about the Silent Thunder operation. There are questions about what happened 8 years ago that need answers. Elena paused in her medical work, realizing that her reappearance would trigger investigations into the classified mission that had officially killed her. The truth about Silent Thunder was complicated and dangerous, involving operational decisions that had saved lives but violated official protocols. Captain, Silent Thunder is classified beyond my clearance level to discuss in the field, Elena replied carefully. Command will need to arrange proper debriefing protocols. But Elena knew that avoiding the Silent Thunder discussion would be impossible now that she had revealed her survival to military authorities. The mission had involved activities that powerful people had wanted buried, and her reappearance could complicate political arrangements that had been made following the official cover-up. Agent Cooper was receiving updates about federal response to the situation, including arrangements for transporting the military casualties to secure medical facilities. But Cooper was also getting instructions about Elena's status that suggested her reactivation might be more permanent than originally indicated. "Sergeant Santos," Cooper said quietly, "Command wants you transported to Washington for full debriefing. Once this operation is complete, there are questions about your activities during the past 8 years that require official review." Elena had expected this development, but hearing it confirmed created anxiety about returning to the world of classified operations and political complications that she had escaped by disappearing. Her peaceful life in Cedar Falls was ending, and she wasn't sure what would replace it. The third casualty required less intensive medical intervention, but Elena's examination revealed injuries that would require specialized treatment at a military medical facility. Her assessment was thorough and documented according to military medical protocols that she hadn't used in 8 years. As Elena completed treatment of all 3 casualties, she could hear helicopter rotors approaching through the snow. Military medical evacuation had arrived to transport the injured soldiers to appropriate medical facilities. But Elena realized that her own future was now uncertain. "Elena," Jake Morrison said as they prepared to transfer the casualties to the evacuation helicopters, "what happens to you now? Are you going back to the military?" Elena looked at her Cedar Falls colleagues who had supported her during the operation without question, even after learning that everything they thought they knew about her was false. Their loyalty and professionalism had made the rescue possible, but it had also exposed them to classified military operations that would complicate their lives. "I don't know, Jake," Elena answered honestly. 8 years ago, I thought my military career was over. Today, it looks like Phoenix 7 might be needed again." As the casualties were loaded onto the evacuation helicopters, Elena realized that her demonstration of medical and tactical competence had reminded military authorities of capabilities they thought they had lost. The successful rescue operation had proven that Phoenix 7's skills were still sharp and still valuable for special operations requirements. Captain Williams shook Elena's hand before boarding the evacuation helicopter. "Phoenix 7, outstanding work today. Command is going to want you back on active duty. The unit needs medics with your capabilities." Elena watched the helicopters disappear into the snowy sky, carrying away the casualties she had saved, but also carrying news of her survival to authorities who would demand explanations and decisions about her future. The radio call that had revealed her identity had led to consequences she was only beginning to understand. Agent Cooper approached Elena as the rescue team prepared to return to Cedar Falls. "Sergeant Santos, we need to discuss your immediate status and the security implications of today's operation." Elena nodded, knowing that her 8 years of peaceful anonymity were definitively over. Phoenix 7 had answered the call one more time, but the cost of that response might be the loss of the normal life she had built in the small mountain town that had become home. The drive back to Cedar Falls took place in contemplative silence, with Elena's mind processing the implications of her exposure, while her colleagues absorbed the reality of who they had been working alongside for 8 months. The snow continued falling, creating a sense of isolation that matched Elena's internal struggle between her desire for anonymity and the undeniable pull of her specialized calling. Agent Cooper broke the silence as they approached the town limits. "Sergeant Santos, I've received instructions to facilitate your secure transport to Washington within 48 hours. Command wants a full debriefing about Silent Thunder and your activities since disappearing." Elena nodded without surprise. She had always known that reappearing would trigger investigations into the classified mission that had officially killed her and the 8 years she had spent in hiding. The truth about both subjects was complicated and politically sensitive. "What about the people here?" Elena asked, gesturing toward her Cedar Falls colleagues. They've been exposed to classified operations because they helped save lives. I won't let them suffer consequences for my decisions. Cooper consulted her secure device before responding. Federal authorities understand that civilian involvement was necessary for the rescue operation. Your colleagues will be debriefed and asked to sign confidentiality agreements, but there won't be negative consequences for their assistance. Jake Morrison, who had been listening to the exchange, spoke up from the back seat. Elena, we knew we were getting into something classified when we volunteered to help. We're not worried about the consequences. We're worried about you. The concern in Jake's voice reflected the genuine relationships Elena had built during her time in Cedar Falls. These people had come to care about her as a person, not just as a capable volunteer, and they were struggling with the realization that she might disappear from their lives as suddenly as she had appeared. When they arrived at the fire station, Chief Walsh was waiting with coffee and questions. The successful rescue operation had saved lives, but it had also revealed that his volunteer had been someone entirely different from who she had claimed to be. Elena, or whoever you really are, Walsh said with a mixture of respect and confusion, I need to understand what just happened. You performed medical procedures that exceed anything in volunteer training, and you coordinated with military personnel like you'd done it before. Elena sat down across from Walsh, realizing that she owed these people honest explanations, even if she couldn't reveal classified details. Chief, my real name is Maria Elena Santos. 8 years ago, I was a special operations medic attached to units that conducted classified missions. Operation Silent Thunder went wrong, and I was officially listed as killed in action. The explanation was simple but profound, providing context for Elena's capabilities, while raising new questions about why she had needed to disappear and what threats might still exist. Why hide here? Lisa Chun asked. Why not stay in the military and continue the work you were obviously good at? Elena's answer revealed the moral complexity that had defined her situation for 8 years. Silent Thunder required operational decisions that saved lives but violated official protocols. When the political fallout began, it became clear that some people needed scapegoats more than they needed the truth. Dr. Mitchell, who had arrived to check on Elena after hearing about the classified rescue operation, added professional observations about Elena's medical competence. Your surgical technique was exceptional. You performed procedures under field conditions that most trauma surgeons would hesitate to attempt in proper operating rooms. The recognition was gratifying, but Elena was more concerned about the future than past accomplishments. Her reappearance had created a situation where powerful people would demand answers about classified operations and activities that some had preferred to keep buried. Agent Cooper received a priority communication that required her immediate attention. After a brief conversation, she approached Elena with news that would determine her immediate future. Sergeant Santos, there's been a development. The November 7 Alpha casualties you treated have provided testimony about your medical intervention that's generated significant command interest. You're being recalled to active duty effective immediately. Elena felt a mixture of relief and apprehension at the news. Active duty would provide official protection and purpose, but it would also expose her to the same political complications that had forced her disappearance years earlier. What about the threats that made me disappear in the first place? Elena asked. Silent Thunder created enemies who might still consider me a liability. Cooper's response was reassuring, but not entirely comforting. 8 years have changed the political landscape. The people who wanted you eliminated are no longer in positions of authority. Your medical expertise is needed more than your silence is valued. Frank Kowalski arrived at the fire station after hearing rumors about Elena's military background and the classified rescue operation. His hardware store employee had revealed herself to be someone with capabilities he had never imagined. Elena, you've been working for me for months, and I never suspected anything like this, Frank said with admiration. Your equipment knowledge makes sense now. You weren't just interested in tools. You understood them from professional experience. The recognition from people who had come to know and respect Elena created an emotional complexity that she hadn't anticipated. Her deception had been necessary for survival, but it had also prevented authentic relationships that she now realized she valued deeply. Chief Walsh made a decision that reflected the respect Elena had earned during her time in Cedar Falls. "Sergeant Santos, you'll always have a place here if you want it. The volunteer position remains open, and this community would be honored to have you return." Elena was moved by the offer, recognizing that Cedar Falls had become the closest thing to home she had experienced since her official death. The relationship she had built and the sense of purpose she had found were irreplaceable. "Chief, I may not be Elena Martinez anymore, but the work we've done together has meant everything to me," Elena replied. "If the military will allow it, I'd like to maintain connections with this community." Agent Cooper was organizing Elena's secure transport to Washington while ensuring that the Cedar Falls personnel understood their obligations regarding the classified aspects of the rescue operation. The administrative details were complex, but the fundamental change in Elena's status was clear. Tom Rodriguez approached Elena as preparations for her departure continued. "You saved lives today, just like you've been doing quietly for months. That's who you really are, regardless of what name you use." The observation captured something essential about Elena's character that transcended issues of identity and classification. Her commitment to helping others had remained constant through military service, enforced disappearance, and civilian life. As Elena prepared to leave Cedar Falls for an uncertain future in Washington, she realized that her 8 years of hiding had ended not with capture or exposure, but with a choice to help people who needed her unique capabilities. Phoenix 7 had answered the call one final time, but Maria Elena Santos was finally free to determine her own future. The radio transmission that had started everything was now just hours old, but it had changed Elena's life completely. Her carefully constructed anonymity was gone, but in its place was the possibility of serving openly again with the full support of the community that had unknowingly sheltered her during her years of exile. 3 months later, Phoenix 7 was back where she belonged, not in the shadows, but leading the military's new emergency response integration program, training civilian first responders alongside special operations medics. Her office wall displayed 2 photographs: her official military portrait and a picture of the Cedar Falls Volunteer Fire Department. Elena had negotiated and co-created a picture of the Cedar Falls Volunteer Fire Volunteer, unprecedented arrangement with military command. She would serve as a liaison between special operations medical units and civilian emergency services, spending half her time training elite military medics and half working with volunteer departments across rural America. Her first permanent assignment was establishing a regional training center in Cedar Falls. Phoenix 7 to base, training exercise complete. Elena radioed as she watched volunteer firefighters from 5 counties successfully execute a mass casualty drill that would have been impossible without military-level coordination techniques. Chief Walsh approached her with a smile. "Not bad for a group of weekend warriors, Sergeant Santos." Elena grinned back. "They're not weekend warriors anymore, Chief. They're force multipliers." Jake Morrison jogged over, his medical skills now enhanced by advanced trauma training that Elena had provided. "Ma'am, next week's exercise is going to include helicopter insertion training, right?" "Absolutely." Phoenix 7 doesn't do anything halfway. That evening, Elena sat in her apartment above the bakery, the same one she'd rented as Elena Martinez. But now it was filled with military commendations alongside firefighter appreciation plaques. Her scanner still monitored emergency frequencies, but now she responded to calls in an official capacity, bridge between 2 worlds that had needed each other more than anyone realized. The ghost pilot had found her way home. If you found this story as compelling as we did, hit that subscribe button and join our community of everyday heroes. Share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever encountered someone who wasn't quite what they seemed? What extraordinary people might be hiding in plain sight in your own community? Ring that notification bell, because next week we're bringing you another incredible true story of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Thanks for watching, and remember, heroes are everywhere.